So have you ever had those days or even weeks where, it feels like everything that you're learning, everything that you've been studying, you've been grinding away, kind of just vanishes into thin air? You're looking at something really simple, something you've probably gone over like a whole bunch of times and you're thinking, why can't I do this? It's like all your learning that you've been like really dedicated to, you feel like you're just falling behind, right? You've been grinding away and it feels like you haven't moved just an inch forward. And obviously as a programmer myself now, I know exactly how that feels. I've been coding very consistently every single day we're going on, close to 8 months now. A lot of discipline, a lot of consistency, but I have hit that feeling and I've hit that wall several times. But I found some ways to really think about this differently, to really reframe it in your mind. And I'm going to explain it in this video. I think it's going to be really helpful for you, for those times when you feel like you're learning to code and you feel like your learning is just falling behind. And to start explaining what it is, I want to introduce you to something that I call the pain progress curve. Now, this is not some scientific term. I mean, there might be some science behind it. I didn't do the research. If you want to go out and do the research, be my guest. But it's something that I've just sort of realized over time while I've been learning to code. And it's not even from my experience. Many other developers that I've spoken to as well, they have seen this sort of curve show up a lot while they've been learning to code, even working as a professional programmer. And I want to go through the details of this curve in this video. But first, let me just explain how I sort of got here, how I started thinking about this. Lately, I've really kind of put aside a lot of the, sort of advanced JavaScript, data structures and all that kind of stuff, all the backend technologies. And I've been really trying to level up my responsive design skills, through CSS, Bootstrap, Tailwind, all that sort of thing. But the other day, I was trying to fix a layout on a site that I'm working on. I spent literally 4 hours stuck on this really weird bit of padding in the hero section that I was working on. It just wouldn't go away, this little space of padding that for some reason I just couldn't center the entire, container, and it was just really frustrating. I looked through the whole sort of page of code, over 600 lines of CSS code, and for some reason I just couldn't figure it out. I mean, I couldn't figure it out on that day anyway. The next morning, I came back to it after rethinking about it all night, like sort of going through my head, like, all these different things. I finally figured it out. I tracked it down. And by the way, I was even trying to use ChatGPT to help me debug this CSS code, but ChatGPT was giving me some code. I would put it in and I said, that didn't work. And then it said, try this. And then that didn't work. And then it said, oh, put this again. And all it was doing was sort of looping the same kind of code to give me. So instead I had to go out, do a whole bunch of Google searching, and then eventually I just sort of started working through a process of elimination. But going through this, I felt like, why don't I know this? I should know this by now. Why don't I understand how to remove this small piece of padding? I felt like everything that I've learned, I was just like, what's going on? I feel like I'm really falling behind. But when I think about this curve, in reality, what was actually happening was I was learning a better way of debugging CSS. I even learned a really cool trick, and that is to, put a border around the area that you want to edit within CSS, and you can visualize a lot better the specific area that you're working in, when you're editing your CSS code or the specific container that you're working in. But getting back to this pain progress curve, on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is progress. So when you start out, when you learn to code or whatever small little project that you're working on, you start making these really quick gains, right? And you're feeling really confident, it's feeling really good, but suddenly you hit this dip, right? And that is the doubt phase. And you go through this doubt phase and you feel like, oh my gosh, this is not working. Why can't I get this? I've already done this a million times. Why can't I figure this out? And you're sort of living in this doubt phase for a while. But in reality, what's happening is you are still making progress. You're still moving along the progress line. And if you stick with it for long enough, you're only a couple of hours or a couple of days away from experiencing a moment where everything just clicks. You hit this spike, right? But the hard part is that when you're in this kind of dip doubt phase, it feels like everything is working against you. But like I said, even at that low point, you are still progressing, just slowly and just ever so slightly, but you are still progressing. And this part is really tricky because programming is so mentally taxing that you might not even realize that you're in this phase. When you run out of energy while doing physical activity, for example, your body, it sends you a clear signal that, you've got pain, you've got fatigue. But when you run out of cognitive energy, your brain doesn't say rest. It just, sends you some self-doubt. And that is essentially your signal that you are hitting this doubt phase. So what do you do when you get to this? Well, there's a couple of things that I try to do. The first thing is I try to prime my brain like a muscle. So before I decide to sit down and do some coding, or do something really hard, I kind of want to prime my brain to get ready for what I'm doing. So just like warming up your muscles before you go to the gym, you know, or prepping the food before you decide to start cooking, doing something quick that helps you prep your brain can really help. You know, some things that help me is, you know, I do a little bit of journaling sometimes in the morning, or I do some breathing exercises to get some oxygen into my brain, you know, or having a very nutritious meal to get, you know, my energy levels up. You know, sometimes your brain is just low on glycogen. Maybe things like doing a bit of light reading, I don't know, picking up a book, reading a couple of pages, just to get your brain ready to start accepting information, you know, working through problems, just to try and, you know, grease the engine up a little bit, so to speak. The second thing is to try and stick to a routine. You know, if you sit down to learn something at the same time every single day, your brain, it starts to expect it. It becomes more elastic, more responsive, because it's essentially ready. You know, this is the same reason why, for example, you know, professional fighters train at the same time every day, because they're priming their body to be ready to fight at that time during the day. So they're at their peak performance at that specific time. Now, your routine obviously doesn't have to be perfect. You know, you don't have to worry about waking up and starting to work at like 8:30 every single day. As long as it's within that specific time frame, that's good enough. You know, obviously, you know, bring some common sense into this. The third thing is to, you know, use tools at your disposal. Use AI. You know, you'd be crazy to not be using tools like ChatGPT or Cursor right now as a developer. Get used to prompting, you know, explaining what you're working on. The better prompting that you do, the better responses that you get, which is kind of ironic because I just spoke about a bug that I was using with ChatGPT and it didn't help me. But anyway, just forget that. I'm trying to get better. You try to get better as well. Plus side is that while I was working with ChatGPT to solve this bug, it really helped me to think about the process in different ways. And the fourth thing is, when you feel stuck, just remember this graph, right? If you got progress, you got a little bit of doubt, and then you hit this click phase. You're gonna have moments where everything feels flat, you know, like you're sort of sliding backwards, but in reality, you are making progress ever so slightly, but you are making progress. You're just a few days, a few hours, like I said, away from a breakthrough moment where things start to really click again. So just stick with it, because you're not falling behind. You're going through that doubt phase, and it may feel like you've forgotten everything, like the problem that you're facing is something that you should have mastered a month ago. But that feeling, that's actually, you know, a sign of growth, a sign of progress. So, you know, just realize that when you hit that particular phase, this is where you are on that. This is where you are on the graph, and you're going to have a moment of clarity very soon. So yeah, just remember this pain progress curve. When you are feeling in doubt, when you feel like all the stuff that you've been learning, you know, just feels like you've been falling behind, you are most likely at this phase. So be kind to yourself, you know, take breaks, prime your brain, do all the things that we talked about in this video. And, you know, even if you are battling just a simple padding bug in CSS, you know, you will figure it out. So yeah, anyway, thanks for watching. Thanks for everyone that signed up to my newsletter. If you haven't already, the link is in the description below. I'm sending out more tips and strategies like this. Thank you for everyone that's already signed up. But that's it for now. I'll see you guys in the next one.